I was grading papers after school when the principal knocked and said, "The student you had arrested just got released from Juvie." I froze. He's not supposed to be free for another 6 months. Don't worry, miss. He can't come near the school. There's a restraining order and we have security. But I knew something he didn't. My chest was tightening and I couldn't breathe. The student Parker had whispered to me during his sentencing, "I know it was you, and I'm coming back to prove it." The principal left, and I kept telling myself it would be okay. My door was locked and Parker wouldn't risk coming here. Not one would send him straight back to jail. But then I heard something in the supply closet. Just a small shift, like papers settling. Even worse, the door was slightly open. I always kept it fully closed. Despite my legs shaking, I stood up, grabbing the scissors from my desk drawer. I slowly inched toward the closest, my scissors raised. When I got to it, I grabbed the handle slowly as I could, took a deep breath, and yanked it open ready to swing. But the closet was empty. Nothing but supplies inside. I let out a huge exhale and turned around. That's when I saw him. Parker standing by my desk, holding my gradebook. "Miss Torres, long time no see." I instantly screamed and ran for the door, but he was faster, sliding in front of it. He'd somehow grown in Juvie, gotten even taller and broader, tattooing a teardrop underneath his eye. "That's not very welcoming for your favorite student," I told him with a shaky voice. "Security will be here any second." But he just laughed. "You mean Carl? He's dealing with a fire in the dumpsters behind the gym." Weird how that just started. He started laughing to himself, then calmly walked back to the door and locked it, pocketing the master key in his hand. My eyes shot open. "How did you get that?" "Only Principal Jones has that key," I asked, afraid of the answer. He just smirked. "That doesn't matter. It's just you and me here. Time to talk about what you did." "I didn't do anything to you," I tried to say, but his face twisted with rage. "You planted a knife in my backpack. You called security. You testified against me." My legs started shaking as he raised his voice. "You brought the knife to school." He stepped closer to me. "No, I didn't. You put it there. Because you couldn't prove what I was really doing." My blood went cold. He grinned. "Yeah, I know you know. About what I did to that freshman. About what I was planning for the others." I said, "You hurt that girl." He laughed. "Hurt? She shouldn't have said no. None of them should have. But you couldn't prove it, could you? She was too scared to talk." "They all were." He moved closer. "So you planted the knife." I said, "She was 13. He smiled. "And she learned a valuable lesson about walking alone. Just like you're about to." He grabbed my wrist and twisted it. "You're going to confess. Write it all down. How you framed me because you couldn't protect them any other way." That's when I saw my opening. I raised my knee and drove it directly into his groin. He doubled over instantly, and I just sprinted for the windows, grabbing a chair to smash through them. But he'd recovered fast, tackling me away from them. We crashed into desks, papers flying everywhere. He got on top of me and planted his hands around my throat. "You took everything from me. My fun, my girls, my senior year." He squeezed harder with each sentence. I tried reaching for anything, and my hands landed on a stapler. I smashed it into his temple hard as I could, and he rolled off of me. I scrambled to get up, but he grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, my chin hitting a desk edge. Suddenly, blood was filling my mouth and my molar tooth was in hand. Before I could even react to the pain, he started dragging me towards him by my hair, slamming my face into the whiteboard. The markers scattered everywhere. He yelled, "Write it down! Write what you did to me, how you planted that knife." I grabbed a marker and pretended to write, then spun and jabbed it at his eye. Before I knew it, we were fighting for that marker and crashed into my desk. The computer monitor fell, glass shattering everything. I grabbed a shard, but he knocked it away, pinning my arms above my head. "I spent a year planning this. You're going to confess. Then I'm going to show you what I wanted to show those girls." He yelled at me. I spit blood in his face. He cursed and loosened his grip just enough for me to grab another shard. I slashed at his arm, opening a deep cut. He screamed and stumbled back. I ran for the door, trying to dig the key from his pocket while he fought me. We rolled against the door, him trying to choke me while I tried to reach the key. My vision was going black. With my last strength, I grabbed his wounded arm and dug my thumb into the cut. He howled and pulled back. I got the key, but my hands were too bloody to grip it. It fell, sliding under a desk. We both dove for it, fighting on the floor. He got it first and threw it out the open window. He stood over me, bleeding and furious. "Now no one's leaving until you write that confession." He grabbed my throat again, lifting me up and said, "Either you write it, I'll write it myself, but in your blood." The overhead sprinkler system suddenly kicked on with a loud hiss, and water started pouring down on both of us in thick streams. Parker's grip on my throat loosened just a bit as his head jerked toward the classroom door, and I could see him doing quick math in his head about whether his distraction fire was spreading, or if this was something else. I didn't waste the moment. I raised my hand and dug my fingernails as deep as I could into that cut on his arm where I'd slashed him earlier, raking down through the wound and feeling his blood mix with the water soaking everything. He screamed and shoved me away so hard I crashed sideways into a desk, my hip slamming into the metal edge, and before I could even catch my breath, he was sprinting toward the open window. He dove through it headfirst and I heard him hit the ground outside, then the sound of running footsteps disappearing into the afternoon shadows between buildings. I just laid there for a second in the water trying to breathe. my throat burning and swelling where his hands had been crushing my windpipe. Then my survival brain kicked back in and I crawled toward the classroom door, my hands slipping on the wet floor. I grabbed my desk with shaking arms and shoved it against the door, the legs scraping loud across the tile, then collapsed against it trying to make my fingers work. My phone was still in my pocket, but my hands were covered in blood mixed with sprinkler water, and I kept dropping it. On the third try, I got it unlocked and dialed 911, pressing it against my ear. When the operator answered, I tried to talk, but my voice came out as this horrible, raspy whisper that didn't even sound like me. My throat was already swelling up, so bad I could barely get words out. I managed to croak out my location and that a student attacked me and I needed help now. Then the operator was asking me questions I couldn't really answer because talking hurt too much. I just kept whispering that I was hurt, and he got away, and please send someone. The sprinklers finally shut off and the classroom went quiet, except for water dripping everywhere and my ragged breathing. I don't know how long I sat there with my back against the desk barricade, maybe 3 minutes or maybe 10, but then I heard pounding on the door, and Carl's voice yelling that it was safe now. The fire department was here. I tried to move the desk, but my arms were shaking too bad, so I just sat there until Carl pushed the door open enough to squeeze through. Principal Jones was right behind him, and when he saw me sitting in the puddle of water and blood, he went pale. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't hold me, so I just kind of fell forward into Principal Jones's arms. EMTs rushed past us into the destroyed classroom with their equipment bags, and I realized I was still holding that bloody glass shard in my fist, gripping it so tight my palm was bleeding around it. One of the EMTs gently took it from me and set it aside, then started checking my throat with careful fingers. She told Principal Jones my windpipe wasn't crushed, but the swelling was bad, and I was lucky Parker didn't kill me. Another EMT started taking pictures of my throat with a camera, then moved to photograph my face and the blood in my mouth. Police officers came in next and started moving through the classroom, taking their own pictures of everything. The overturned desks and scattered papers and shattered computer monitor glass all over the floor. Principal Jones kept asking if I was okay, and I couldn't answer because nothing about this was okay. I knew the hard questions were coming about why Parker was so focused on making me confess something, and I didn't know if I could keep lying about the knife I planted in his backpack last year. A young police officer with her hair pulled back in a tight bun sat down next to me on the floor with a notepad and asked me to walk her through what happened tonight. I told her everything in careful detail, starting with hearing something in the supply closet and finding Parker by my desk. I described how he locked the door with a master key he'd stolen somehow, how he demanded I write a confession about framing him, how we fought and he choked me and threatened me. I left out the part about planting the knife in his backpack last year. My statement focused on Parker breaking into my classroom, threatening me about a confession, and attacking me when I fought back and wouldn't give him what he wanted. The officer wrote everything down and asked follow-up questions about the timeline and what exactly Parker said, and I answered as best I could with my damaged throat. The EMT examining my mouth shined a light in, and made a concerned sound, then told me my left molar was completely gone, probably knocked out when Parker slammed my face into the whiteboard. She said I probably had a concussion too based on how my pupils looked, and the confusion she could see in my responses. She strongly recommended I go to the emergency room for a full evaluation of my head injury and throat damage, and I just nodded because my head was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. The classroom looked like a war zone with water still dripping from the ceiling tiles and blood smeared on the whiteboard and floor. Principal Jones stood near the window talking quietly with the police officers, and I caught pieces of their conversation about securing the building and checking camera footage. They loaded me onto a stretcher even though I said I could walk, and wheeled me out through the hallway where other teachers had gathered to watch. I saw their shocked faces as I went past and closed my eyes because I couldn't handle seeing their reactions right now. At the hospital emergency room, they put me in a curtained area and nurses came in to clean up my injuries and take vital signs. I could hear 2 police officers talking in the hallway just outside my curtain about how the dumpster fire was definitely arson. Someone had poured accelerant all over the trash and lit it deliberately to distract security. They were putting out a BOLO alert for Parker with his description and last known address, and one officer mentioned he'd violated his restraining order, which meant automatic arrest whenever they found him. The other officer said something about Parker being 18 now, so this would all be adult charges. No more juvie protection. A doctor came in and examined my throat with a scope, telling me I was lucky the cartilage wasn't crushed, but I'd have significant bruising and swelling for weeks. He prescribed pain medication and said my voice might not sound normal for a while. While I was waiting for discharge papers, I locked myself in the bathroom attached to my ER bay and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was swollen and bruised, my lips split, dried blood in my hair. I started practicing what I'd say if anyone asked about the original knife incident that sent Parker to juvie. I rehearsed explaining that I found credible evidence of his assaults on freshman girls, but the victims were too scared to testify, so I had to find another way to stop him before he hurt more of them. I practiced saying it out loud in different ways, trying to make it sound believable, trying to convince myself it was justified even though I knew planting evidence was illegal. The reflection staring back at me looked like a stranger. They finally discharged me around 1:30 a.m. with prescriptions and follow-up instructions and a packet about concussion symptoms to watch for. A police officer drove me home in his cruiser because my car was still at the school, and when we pulled up to my apartment building, I saw another police cruiser already parked outside for protective surveillance. The officer walked me to my door and checked inside my apartment before leaving, telling me to call 911 if I saw or heard anything suspicious. I locked the door behind him and put the chain on, then just stood there in my dark living room. The adrenaline that had kept me functioning through the attack and the hospital and all the questions suddenly drained away like someone pulled a plug. My legs went weak and I barely made it to my couch before my whole body started shaking uncontrollably. These violent tremors I couldn't stop no matter how hard I tried. I pulled a blanket around myself and curled up on my side, shaking and crying and trying not to think about Parker's hands around my throat, or the look in his eyes when he said he'd write my confession in my blood. The next morning, I woke up on my couch still wearing yesterday's bloody clothes, and my whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. I dragged myself to the bathroom and swallowed some aspirin, then started digging through my purse looking for my phone charger. That's when I noticed something was wrong with my keychain. My classroom master key was missing. The little brass key that opened every door in the building was just gone. My stomach dropped as I realized Parker must have taken it during our fight. He could have already made copies. He could get back into the school whenever he wanted. I called the main office number, but it just rang and rang because campus was closed for the weekend. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone. I sent an email to Principal Jones explaining about the missing key, but it felt completely useless sitting there waiting for a response that might not come until Monday. My phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications from the staff group chat. I opened it and saw dozens of messages from other teachers asking what happened and sharing crazy rumors. Someone said I was in critical condition at the hospital. Another person claimed Parker had a gun. The messages kept coming faster than I could read them. Everyone speculating and adding their own theories about what went down. Then the district sent an official email announcing immediate campus closure for investigation and deep cleaning. They used words like serious incident and student safety, but didn't give any real details. I sat alone in my apartment reading all these messages about my own attack and felt weirdly cut off from everything. Everyone else was processing this together in the group chat, while I was stuck here by myself living through the aftermath. My phone rang and Principal Jones's name popped up on the screen. I answered, and he started talking in this careful voice about how the restraining order was still active, and Parker would be arrested the second he came near campus. He said security was increased and they were changing all the locks. Then he suggested I take some temporary paid leave while the investigation continued. The way he said it made me defensive, like he was trying to push me out when I was the one who got attacked. I told him I needed to think about it, and he said to take my time, but his tone made it clear he really wanted me to say yes. After we hung up, I felt angry and confused about whether he was trying to protect me or just get me out of the way, so the school could handle this quietly. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it and my whole body went cold. It was a photo of my destroyed classroom taken from the doorway. The shattered computer monitor was right in the center of the frame. Glass everywhere. Desks overturned. Below the photo were just 2 words in all caps. Write it. I dropped my phone like it was burning me. Parker was still coming after me. He was still demanding that confession. I grabbed my phone again with shaking hands and took screenshots of the message, then forwarded everything to the police officer who gave me her card at the hospital. Detective Derek Mansfield called me an hour later. He introduced himself and said he was taking over the investigation from the initial responding officers. He wanted to schedule a formal recorded interview at the station and asked if there was any history with Parker I hadn't mentioned yet. His voice was professional and calm, but I could hear the real question underneath his words. Why would a student be this obsessed with forcing a confession from me? What did I do to make him this focused on proving I framed him? I agreed to come in the next day for the interview and hung up feeling sick. The detective was already suspicious of me. At the police station the next morning, I sat in a small interview room with Detective Mansfield and a camera recording everything I said. He asked me to explain my relationship with Parker, and I told him about the pattern I'd noticed. Parker targeted freshman girls, cornered them alone, assaulted them, then threatened them into silence. Multiple students were too scared to report him officially. I described how he bragged to his friends about what he did and made sure the girls knew he could hurt them worse if they talked. Detective Mansfield took notes and asked specific questions about dates and locations. I gave him everything I had except the one thing that mattered most. I never mentioned planting that knife in Parker's backpack. I talked around it, explained how frustrated I felt that these girls were suffering and nobody could touch him, but I didn't confess to manufacturing evidence. The lie felt heavy in my chest, but I couldn't make myself say the words. Rocky Salter from campus security came in halfway through the interview carrying a laptop. He was the head of security, and he looked exhausted and angry. He pulled up camera footage from the day of the attack and showed us the dumpster area where Parker set the fire. The camera that should have caught him approaching was completely spray-painted over. Rocky scrolled back through the timeline and found footage from between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m., showing a figure in a dark hoodie walking up to the camera. The angle made it impossible to see the person's face. Rocky kept apologizing and explaining how the security system had failed, how the cameras should have been checked daily but weren't, how the master key logs were just paper records that anyone could fake. Detective Mansfield asked questions about access points and protocols while I sat there realizing how completely unprepared the school was to keep anyone safe. That evening, I was heating up soup for dinner when my phone rang from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. There was just breathing on the other end. Heavy, deliberate breathing that went on for about 10 seconds. Then the line went dead. My hands were shaking again, and I immediately called Detective Mansfield. He told me to log every single contact attempt like this because it could be evidence of ongoing harassment and witness intimidation. He said to write down the time, the number if I had it, what happened during the call. I started a document on my phone and typed out the details, feeling paranoid and scared in my own apartment. The next day, Leslie Sherman from the District Title IX office reached out through email. She introduced herself and offered trauma counseling resources, then explained my options for reporting the sexual assault threats Parker made during the attack. Her message was kind and professional, but I felt skeptical reading it. The school's security had already failed completely. Parker got into my locked classroom with a stolen key and nobody noticed until he was choking me. What was Title IX going to do that would actually protect me? I appreciated the resources but couldn't shake the feeling that institutional processes were just paperwork that wouldn't stop Parker if he decided to come after me again. Ada Solange Pappas called and requested a meeting to discuss charges. I met her at the courthouse and she laid out the case in clear terms. Burglary for breaking into my classroom. Assault with intent to cause serious injury for the attack itself. Violation of the protective order for coming near me at all. She said these charges were solid based on the physical evidence and my testimony. The destroyed classroom, my injuries, the hospital records, everything pointed to Parker. Her confidence was the first thing that made me feel actual hope since the attack. She explained potential sentences and said she was building the strongest case possible. For the first time, I thought maybe Parker would actually face real consequences that would keep him away from me and away from other girls he might hurt. The next morning, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and a man introduced himself as Aldo Roberts from the teachers' union. He said Principal Jones contacted him about my case, and he needed to meet with me right away. I felt weird about involving the union because it seemed like admitting I couldn't handle this myself, but Aldo was firm when we met at a coffee shop downtown. He explained that any future police interviews or district meetings needed him present because my injuries and the media attention created serious exposure risk. I tried to argue that I didn't need a babysitter, but he cut me off and said union representation wasn't about weakness. It was exactly what the union existed for. His no-nonsense attitude actually made me feel a bit better, like someone was finally in my corner who understood how bad this could get. Later that afternoon, Rocky called and asked me to come back to campus to review some findings about the master key system. When I got there, he spread out these old paper logbooks on his desk that looked like they were from the 1990s. He pointed to pages with incomplete entries, illegible handwriting, and entire weeks with no records at all. Rocky estimated Parker could have stolen or copied a key months ago, and nobody would have caught it because the whole tracking system was basically honor-based. I felt sick looking at those sloppy records and realizing how completely the school's security had failed, not just the night Parker attacked me, but for months or maybe years before. That evening, I was scrolling through Instagram when a DM popped up from someone named Jennifer Valdez. The name sounded familiar, and then I remembered she was a student I taught 3 years ago, a quiet girl who always sat in the back. Her message was long and detailed, explaining that everyone in Parker's friend group knew he bragged about assaulting girls and getting away with it. She wrote that he would laugh about it at lunch and his friends thought it was funny or cool or something. Then she named 2 more possible victims, both freshmen last year, and included their Instagram handles. Reading those names made my chest hurt because I'd been gathering evidence for so long, but clearly hadn't moved fast enough to protect everyone. I immediately forwarded the message to Detective Mansfield with a note asking if he could reach out to these girls. He called me back within an hour and thanked me for the information, but then firmly told me not to contact any potential victims directly because it could mess up their statements. His caution made total sense legally, but I felt so impatient with the whole process when I knew these girls needed support right now, not weeks from now after lawyers sorted everything out. The next day, I had an appointment with the trauma counselor Leslie had recommended, and the session actually helped me feel slightly less crazy about my constant fear. Walking back to my car afterward in the parking garage, I noticed something weird on my windshield. Someone had scratched a small drawing of a knife into the frost, and it looked like it was done with dry erase marker or something similar. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I could get them in the lock. I sat in my car with the doors locked and called Detective Mansfield, my voice coming out high and scared. He told me to stay put and a patrol car would come document it, then asked if the garage had security cameras. I said I thought so, but wasn't sure. Rocky got pulled into reviewing the parking garage footage and called me that evening with an update. He'd spotted a hooded figure approaching my car around 6 in the morning when the lot was still dark and totally empty. The camera angle wasn't great, but it caught a partial license plate from a car that was just sitting there idling nearby, like someone was waiting for the person to finish. Rocky sent all the information to Detective Mansfield right away for follow-up. The next morning, I met with Pappas again at her office, and she walked me through which charges she could file immediately versus which ones needed more evidence. She laid out papers on her desk showing burglary and assault charges were solid based on what happened in my classroom, but she was honest that the sexual assault threats were really hard to prosecute without someone else who heard them. I felt that old anger rising up about how the system's limits kept protecting dangerous people, and Pappas must have seen it on my face because she quickly added that she was still building the strongest case possible. 2 days later, Detective Mansfield called with news that made my heart race. Police had located and arrested Parker at a skate shop 2 towns over based on the partial plate match and witness identification from the shop owner. Parker denied everything and claimed he'd been staying with friends all week. but Mansfield sounded carefully hopeful when he explained they had enough to hold him. The relief I felt was huge, but also scary because I knew this was just the beginning of more legal fighting. Mansfield asked me to come to the station the next day to listen to some recorded jail calls. When I got there, he played several calls Parker had made from county jail, and one of them had this breathing pattern that matched exactly what I'd heard on that blocked number harassment call. I felt my stomach drop hearing it because the match seemed so obvious to me. But then Parker's defense attorney immediately jumped in, objecting that voice identification was too subjective and unreliable. I watched the whole thing fall apart in real time as the lawyer picked at every piece of evidence, making it sound questionable or circumstantial. That same afternoon, the local news picked up the story, and suddenly it was everywhere. I made the mistake of reading the online comment sections and felt like I was going to be sick. People were accusing me of ruining a troubled kid's life over a schoolyard fight, saying teachers like me were what was wrong with education. Anonymous commenters started speculating about what I must have done to make Parker so angry, suggesting I probably came onto him or failed him unfairly, or had some personal grudge. The victim blaming made me so furious I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but instead I just turned it off and sat there shaking. The next morning, Aldo called me into his office at the Union Building downtown. He sat across from me with folders spread on his desk and told me straight up that I needed to delete all my social media accounts immediately. He explained that anything I posted could be used against me in court or twisted by Parker's defense team. I nodded, but then he mentioned connecting me with a PR consultant who specialized in teacher crisis communications. The consultant's retainer was $3,000 up front. My stomach twisted because I was already barely covering rent and medical bills from the attack. Aldo saw my face and said the union could maybe help with costs, but their budget was tight this quarter. I left his office feeling trapped between wanting to defend myself online and knowing I couldn't afford professional help or risk making things worse legally. 2 days later, Leslie called me to her office at the District Title IX building. She had printed out a detailed safety plan for when campus eventually reopened. The plan included modified schedules so I wouldn't be in my classroom during passing periods when Parker's friends could track my movements. She suggested using different entrances each day and parking in visitor spots instead of the staff lot. Leslie walked through each point methodically, and I appreciated the structure even though I hated needing this level of security at my own workplace. She asked if I felt comfortable with the accommodations, and I said yes because what else could I say? That afternoon, I had my regular session with Hope at her counseling office across town. I sat on her couch and confessed that I'd been checking my apartment locks 5 times before bed and jumping at every sudden noise. Hope leaned forward and told me those responses were completely normal after violent assault. She explained that my brain was trying to protect me by staying alert to danger. Then she taught me a specific bedtime routine where I check each lock once while saying out loud what I'm doing. The verbal component helps my brain register that I actually checked instead of just going through motions. Hope made me practice it right there in her office with her door lock. Walking through the steps with her guidance made me feel slightly less crazy about my paranoia. The next morning, Detective Mansfield called with news that changed everything about the case. He told me Parker had turned 18 2 months ago, which meant all charges would be filed in adult court instead of the juvenile system. Mansfield explained that adult convictions carried much more serious sentences, and Parker would face real prison time instead of another stint in juvie. I felt this grim satisfaction spread through my chest, knowing he would finally face actual consequences. Mansfield said the prosecutor was already refiling everything in Superior Court. 3 days later, I was back in Hope's office for my next session. The guilt about planting that knife had been eating at me since the attack, and I finally told her the complete truth. I explained how I'd found the knife in the school parking lot and slipped it into Parker's backpack because the freshman victims were too scared to testify. Hope listened without any judgment on her face. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she strongly urged me to consult with a criminal defense lawyer before telling police anything. She explained that my disclosure could expose me to charges for evidence tampering or obstruction. The weight of potentially facing criminal charges myself made my hands shake. Hope reminded me that our sessions were confidential, unless I posed a danger to myself or others. That same week, a parent email chain started circulating through the school community. Someone forwarded it to my personal email, and I made the mistake of reading through the entire thread. Some parents praised me for trying to protect students even when the system failed. Others questioned my judgment and professionalism. One parent wrote that teachers who take the law into their own hands shouldn't be around children. Another defended me saying desperate situations require desperate measures. Reading strangers debate my entire teaching career made me feel exposed and defensive. I wanted to respond and explain everything but remembered Aldo's advice about staying silent. The next day, Pappas called me to her office and pressured me for any physical evidence from Parker's earlier assaults on the freshman girls. I had to admit I only kept dated notes about concerning behaviors I'd observed and conversations I'd overheard. Pappas looked frustrated as she reviewed my documentation. She said notes were helpful for establishing a pattern, but we needed concrete proof to build a stronger case against Parker. My careful documentation suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. I'd spent months watching and recording, but it wasn't enough for the legal system. 2 days later, Mansfield called with news about the 13-year-old victim. He'd located her withdrawn complaint form buried deep in old school records. The form showed her parents had refused to let her proceed with charges because they feared retaliation from Parker. Mansfield read me parts of her original statement over the phone. Hearing her describe what Parker did to her in that empty hallway made me physically sick. I had to put the phone down and breathe deeply to keep from throwing up. My anger at the system's failure to protect this child burned even hotter than before. That afternoon, everything exploded online. Parker's friends posted a video on social media calling me a liar who framed an innocent student. The video showed them outside the school talking about how Parker was a good guy who got railroaded by a bitter teacher. Within 2 hours, someone posted my home address in the comments section. I watched in real time as the threats started pouring in. People I'd never met said I deserved whatever happened to me. Someone wrote that teachers like me should be taught a lesson. Another comment suggested someone should pay me a visit at my address. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I immediately called Aldo, who told me to file a police report for the doxing right away. Then I called Papas, who said she would explore adding witness intimidation charges against whoever posted my address. She explained the legal process would take time to identify the poster and build a case. Meanwhile, I was sitting alone in my apartment knowing that strangers with violent intentions now knew exactly where I lived. Leslie called me within an hour of my police report and said she knew someone who ran a shelter network that sometimes took non-domestic violence cases when safety was critical. I grabbed a duffel bag and started throwing clothes into it with shaking hands. My toothbrush, my laptop, a few books I'd never read but couldn't leave behind. Every item I packed felt like admitting defeat, like Parker was pushing me out of my own home even from whatever hole he was hiding in. The shelter address would stay secret, Leslie promised. Only she and the police would know where I was staying. That single fact let me breathe a little easier as I locked my apartment door and drove to the address Leslie texted me. The building looked ordinary from outside, just another house on a quiet street, and the woman who answered the door introduced herself but told me not to share her name with anyone. My room was small with a twin bed and a desk, but the door had a real lock and nobody on the internet knew I was here. 2 days later, I met with Hope for our regular session and she could tell I was barely holding it together. She taught me this technique for when panic attacks started, telling me to name 5 things I could see right then in her office. I listed the clock, the tissue box, her degree on the wall, the blue chair, the window blinds. Then 4 things I could touch: the couch fabric, my jeans, my phone case, the pillow next to me. She walked me through it twice more until my heartbeat slowed from that racing feeling where I thought I might pass out. We set tiny goals for the next week that felt almost embarrassing in how small they were. Take 1 short walk outside the shelter. Cook 1 real meal instead of eating protein bars. Call 1 friend just to talk about normal things. But these little tasks felt possible when everything else in my life was spinning out of control. Detective Mansfield called me 3 days after I moved into the shelter with news that made my hands go cold. He'd gotten a search warrant for Parker's phone and found something that proved this whole attack was planned way in advance. There was a photo of my classroom whiteboard taken 3 days before Parker broke in and attacked me. The photo showed my daily schedule written in my handwriting with my planning period circled in red marker. Mansfield explained this proved Parker had been inside my classroom earlier that week, probably during lunch or after school when I stepped out. He knew exactly when to find me alone because I'd written it right there on the board like an invitation. The image of Parker standing in my empty classroom days before, studying my schedule and planning his attack, made me feel sick. He'd been patient and careful, not just angry and impulsive like I'd tried to tell myself. Papas called me in for a meeting the next afternoon and her tone was different from our previous conversations. She told me Parker's defense attorney was already building a strategy to attack my credibility and professional judgment. They were going to argue I had a vendetta against Parker, that I'd targeted him unfairly, that my testimony couldn't be trusted. Papas needed to know about any potential issues in my background before the defense surprised us in court with something she wasn't prepared to handle. She looked at me directly and asked if there was anything about my history with Parker that I hadn't disclosed yet. My throat went tight and I realized I couldn't keep hiding the planted knife truth any longer. If I stayed silent and the defense discovered it somehow, the entire case could fall apart, and Parker might walk free. I spent that whole night lying awake in my shelter bed trying to decide what to do. By morning, I knew I had to tell the truth even if it destroyed everything. I called Aldo and asked him to be present as my union representative when I made this disclosure to Mansfield and Papas. He agreed immediately and scheduled a conference room at the district office for the next day. Walking into that room felt like stepping off a cliff where I couldn't see the bottom. Aldo sat next to me while Mansfield and Papas sat across the table with notepads and recording equipment. I took a breath and told them everything about planting the knife in Parker's backpack last year, how I'd watched him target freshman girls for months, how the 13-year-old victim was too scared to report him officially, how I couldn't get anyone to listen or investigate, so I put that knife in his bag and called security myself. The words came out steady even though my hands were shaking under the table. Papas listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she explained very clearly that I could face obstruction of justice charges or a professional misconduct investigation from the state teaching board. Evidence tampering was a serious crime even when the motive was protecting students. She appreciated my honesty and started documenting everything I said with careful questions about exact dates and specific details. I could feel the trust between us shifting, like something had broken even though she acknowledged out loud that I was trying to protect vulnerable kids. Mansfield asked follow-up questions about how I accessed Parker's backpack and whether anyone witnessed me planting the knife. I answered everything truthfully while Aldo took notes and occasionally asked them to clarify their questions. By the end of the meeting, I felt completely exposed but also relieved that I wasn't carrying this secret anymore while trying to seek justice. The next week, Aldo went into negotiation mode with the school district about my employment status. He secured limited administrative leave terms while they reviewed my conduct, making sure I'd keep getting paid, and my benefits would continue during the investigation. The financial relief was huge because I'd been terrified of losing my income while living in a shelter and paying legal bills, but my professional future felt completely up in the air. I'd been teaching for 6 years and built a reputation as someone students trusted. Now I was under investigation for evidence tampering, and I had no idea if I'd ever stand in front of a classroom again. Aldo assured me he'd fight any termination attempts, but I couldn't stop wondering if doing the right thing the wrong way was going to cost me my entire career. Leslie didn't waste any time using my nightmare to push for changes. She initiated a full district review of master key controls and security camera coverage across all campuses. Rocky compiled a detailed corrective action plan with specific timelines for upgrading locks, installing additional cameras, and implementing a digital tracking system for key access. Reading through his report gave me a weird sense of purpose beyond just surviving. Maybe my attack would prevent future security failures. Maybe some other teacher wouldn't have to fight off a violent student because the school actually had working safety systems. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was something. 2 weeks after my confession to Pappas, Mansfield called with careful news. One of the previously silent freshman victims had agreed to give a confidential statement after her parents consulted with an attorney. He couldn't tell me her name or specific details, but hearing that she found the courage to speak made my protective instincts surge with this tender hope. Her statement might strengthen the case against Parker and show his pattern of predatory behavior, but I was also terrified the legal process would traumatize her even more. She was just a kid who'd already been hurt, and now she had to describe what happened to strangers in official settings. I asked Mansfield to make sure she had victim advocacy support, and he promised she was being taken care of properly. The relief I felt about the freshman victim's statement lasted exactly 3 days. Then Parker's defense team filed a motion to exclude the phone evidence claiming chain of custody violations during the search warrant execution. I watched the hearing remotely from a laptop in the shelter common room and felt my anxiety spike as their attorney argued the photo of my whiteboard should be thrown out. The judge asked detailed questions about how the phone was handled and stored, and Mansfield had to walk through every step of the evidence collection process. I expected the judge to rule immediately, but instead he took the motion under advisement, which meant we'd have to wait for his written decision. Sitting there watching the screen go dark after the hearing ended, I realized nothing about this process was going to be quick or certain, and Parker's team would fight every single piece of evidence we had. Hope's office had this calm quiet that felt wrong after weeks of chaos, but she sat across from me with a notepad and started walking me through exactly how court testimony worked. She explained I needed to answer only what the lawyers directly asked, nothing more or less, and if I felt panic rising, I should use the grounding phrase we practiced. We ran through my testimony over and over, her playing both the prosecutor and defense attorney, asking questions about Parker breaking in and attacking me until my voice stopped shaking quite so badly. She made me describe the attack 10 different times, each one getting slightly easier to say out loud without my throat closing up. By the end of our session, I could walk through the whole sequence without crying, though my hands still trembled when I talked about Parker's hands around my neck. Hope reminded me to make eye contact with the judge, not the defense attorney, and to pause before answering if I needed a moment to breathe. The preliminary hearing happened 3 days later in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. I sat in the witness box with my hands folded tight in my lap, while Pappas asked me to describe what happened that afternoon in my classroom. I told the judge about Parker appearing by my desk, demanding I write a confession about planting the knife, then attacking me when I refused. My voice stayed mostly steady as I described fighting for my life, the broken glass, the blood filling my mouth when my tooth got knocked out. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination and asked about my relationship with Parker before the knife incident, hinting at my history of questionable tactics without saying anything specific. I forced myself to breathe slowly like Hope taught me, maintaining eye contact with the judge while I answered that I'd been concerned about Parker's behavior toward female students. The defense attorney pressed about what kind of concerns, clearly fishing for something, but Pappas objected, and the judge sustained it. After 20 more minutes of questions, the judge dismissed me, and I walked back to my seat on shaking legs. The judge took maybe 5 minutes to review the evidence before granting a strict expansion of the no-contact order and remanding Parker to custody pending trial. Watching 2 bailiffs lead Parker away in handcuffs gave me this measured sense of relief, like finally something went right, though I knew this was just one step in a long process. Parker's face stayed blank as they walked him out, but his eyes found mine for just a second, and the cold calculation there made my stomach drop. The school board held an emergency meeting 2 days later, and I sat in the back row listening to them debate my future like I wasn't even there. 3 board members openly called for my resignation pending the misconduct review, saying the district couldn't afford the liability exposure from a teacher who planted evidence. Principal Jones defended my teaching record and explained the impossible position I'd been in with victims too scared to testify, but I could hear the political calculations in his careful words. He was protecting the school more than protecting me, which I understood but still stung. Some parents spoke during public comment supporting me, saying I'd clearly been trying to protect their kids, but others demanded answers about why I'd been allowed to stay after breaking the law. The public shaming burned hot in my chest as I sat there unable to defend myself, while strangers picked apart my choices. The board voted to continue my paid leave pending completion of both the criminal case and their internal review, which felt like exile dressed up as procedure. Leslie called me the next morning with news that the freshman victim had agreed to work with specialized advocacy services and trauma counseling through the Title IX office. Leslie made it very clear there was no pressure for the girl to participate in any criminal proceedings, that her safety and healing came first above everything else. I felt grateful Leslie understood that justice couldn't come at the cost of traumatizing a kid even more than she'd already been hurt. Knowing the girl had support made the whole nightmare feel slightly less pointless, like maybe something good could come from all this destruction. Pappas reached out later that week to tell me she'd approached Parker's defense attorney about a possible plea deal on the burglary and assault charges. The sexual assault counts would remain uncharged pending additional evidence, which made my jaw clench with frustration. The plea would guarantee some prison time and supervised probation, but I felt bitter that his whole predatory pattern might never get fully addressed in court. Pappas reminded me that getting any conviction was better than risking a trial we might lose, and I knew she was right, even though it felt like settling. Aldo met me at a coffee shop near the shelter to discuss transfer options within the district. He'd secured an opening at another campus if I wanted it, though he was honest that there was no guarantee of a completely clean slate anywhere. The choice felt like picking between exile to somewhere new where nobody knew me, or staying at my old school where I'd always be the teacher who planted evidence. Neither option felt like winning, just different versions of losing. I asked Aldo what he'd do, and he said honestly he didn't know, that this was my life and my career to rebuild however I thought best. Moving day came on a cold Tuesday morning when I packed my few belongings from the shelter into my car and drove across town to a small apartment with better security. The building had cameras in the hallways and a key fob entry system, which helped me breathe a little easier at night. I enrolled in a basic self-defense course at the community center, showing up twice a week to learn strikes and escape techniques. These small actions made me feel slightly less powerless, like I was building actual skills to protect myself instead of just hiding and hoping nothing bad would happen. The instructor was patient when I flinched at sudden movements, understanding when I needed to step out for a minute to catch my breath. 3 weeks after my testimony, the plea hearing concluded with Parker accepting guilt on burglary, felony assault, and witness intimidation charges. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in state prison and 5 years supervised probation, making him a registered offender with serious restrictions on where he could live and work. I sat in the courtroom feeling relief mixed with this lingering anger that the sexual assault charges got dropped completely. Pappas reminded me afterward that 4 years was actually a significant sentence, and that Parker would be marked as a violent offender for the rest of his life. I knew she was right, but it still felt incomplete, like justice with a bunch of missing pieces. 2 months after the attack, I started working part-time at a different campus on the other side of the district, with updated security protocols and administrators who knew my full history. The principal there had read all the reports and met with me personally to explain their safety systems and support resources. I kept detailed documentation of everything, every student interaction and security concern, building a paper trail to protect myself. My therapy appointments with Hope continued every week, working through the trauma and learning to manage the hypervigilance that made me jump at sudden sounds. I practiced the safety routines Hope taught me each night before bed, checking locks and windows in a specific order that helped me feel slightly more in control. The acceptance that feeling secure was something I had to build daily through small choices, rather than a permanent state I'd ever fully reach again, settled over me like a heavy blanket. Some days were better than others. Some nights I slept through without nightmares. And slowly I started believing I might actually survive this after all. Yeah, so that's the whole insane story about the teacher and the student. 4 years in prison for him, new life for her, wild stuff. If you stuck around for all of that, might as well hit subscribe for more crazy true stories. See you next time.